Today's video is brought to you by Third Wave Water. If I was starting my coffee journey today, there are a lot of things that I would do, but there are also a lot of things that I definitely wouldn't do. There's a ton that I learned the hard way. I wasted a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of good coffee trying to figure out all this stuff. If I was starting over today, I wouldn't buy a Mr. Coffee blade grinder or a Cuisinart espresso machine. And I definitely wouldn't try and use those two things together. I have a real soft spot for the Chemex. It was one of my first brewers, but I don't think I would actually start out with that either. And again, especially not using a Mr. Coffee blade grinder. But here's what I want you to stick around for. There are a couple of things that I actually got right, things that are actually almost always missed when people are starting out with this stuff. And we're going to get to those things in a minute. But what would I do in broad strokes if I was starting out today? One of the things that I actually got right from nearly the very beginning is something that makes a bigger difference than anything else we're going to talk about in this video. And that is starting with really, really great coffee. You know, if you're getting coffee from the grocery store, it's somewhat generic. There's either no roast date on it or it has been roasted months and months ago. You got to do something different. I would actually start by looking up specialty coffee roasters, either in your local city, or maybe even a safer bet is looking them up in your nearest metropolitan area. Go on their site, look up their coffees, and try and find a coffee that has like chocolate or caramel notes. These are going to be more approachable and familiar feeling coffees within the spectrum of specialty coffees, and they're going to make a great starting point. Getting coffee like that will be a huge improvement over what you can find in the grocery store. It will feel familiar in terms of what you're getting in the cup, but will be several notches above. And there's lots of room later on for more adventurous coffees with kind of crazy tasting notes and that kind of thing. Trust me on this, this is the one thing that you should not second guess when it comes to spending a little bit more on this stuff. Now, the second thing that I would suggest is to get a coffee scale. You know, if you're using that tablespoon measuring spoon to measure out your coffee, your eyeball and your water, leave all that stuff behind, get a good scale. It's going to make your coffee making way more consistent brew to brew. And everything that comes after that will get easier. You don't have to spend a lot. You can even just go on Amazon, search up coffee scale, pick one up. Now, after you have good coffee and a coffee scale, the thing that people tend to focus on next after that is their brewer. And that's actually not what I would suggest looking at next. This is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but your coffee grinder actually has way more of an impact on how your coffee tastes than what you're using to brew it. Here's how that works. You see, it all comes down to, in broad strokes, something called particle size uniformity. How even are the particles of ground coffee coming out of your coffee grinder? Lower end coffee grinders, blade grinders, are especially prone to this, but low end burr grinders can also do it, will produce a very inconsistent grind size. So you get a lot of these really little tiny, almost dust-sized particles in your grounds, along with these really big shards of coffee beans. You can see this when you look at the coffee grounds. And what happens when you brew those coffee grounds is the little tiny particles extract very quickly because they're so small. All the flavor comes out, and then they over extract, and stuff that actually doesn't taste very good also comes out. And that imparts a somewhat bitter flavor into your coffee. But those big shards, on the other hand, those huge particles in there, because they're larger, they extract a lot more slowly. So in some cases, by the time you're finished your brew, they're not fully extracted and only the most sour compounds have come out of them. Now, it all does mix up in the cup and it kind of balances, but it also doesn't always taste great. Nicer coffee grinders grind in a much more uniform way so that when you're brewing, all the particles extract at a similar rate, making for a much more balanced and even flavor. And fortunately, there are a lot better coffee grinders available for a lot less than when I started. And if I was starting out today, I would probably start out with a grinder like the Espresso Q Air or the Q. Basically the same grinder, just the Q has a metal body. These grinders really just offer a lot, you know, good build, great results in the cup, reasonable price. There just isn't a lot to argue with here. Now, if I wanted to get something that could do both filter and espresso, I would probably end up with a Kin Grinder K6. There's some things that I don't actually love with them about their build quality, how they're put together, that kind of thing, but they are so affordable, and they can do both filter and espresso with a good degree of flexibility. Now, not everybody is going to love the idea of hand grinding every time you want to make a cup of coffee. So if you want an electric grinder, I'd actually recommend you save up a couple $100, give or take, before you make a move. Seems like a lot, it'll make a difference. At that point, the tried and true options are the Baratza Encore for filter coffee only, or the Encore ESP for filter and espresso. Kind of like a mainline grinder suggestion. They've been around a long time. Really great after sales support there too. If you want to get into a flat burr coffee grinder, it's a different type of coffee grinder, you could look at the DF54. Now that is a single dosing grinder, so you can't just dump a whole bag of coffee in there and grind a little bit every time. You need to weigh it out every time. Not everybody's into that. And if you're the kind of person who, you've done some deep diving, maybe you're a little geeky, you want to get into the 64 millimeter burr size, and you're willing to take a little bit of a gamble, you could look at the Chardor grinder as well. Now, it's really affordable, especially for that burr size. So it's not going to have the same polish of the other grinder options, and it hasn't been on the market as long either. But overall, I would say kind of take a look between those options and see what works best. But now that we've got grinders kind of sorted, if I was starting over, let's talk about brewers. This is kind of the fun part that people love to talk about. Now, I started with a Chemex, and then I got a V60. And I had a pretty rough experience with both of those things, actually, when I first started with them. And I don't actually think that I would suggest either of them for a first brewer. Instead, I would actually probably start with either a Hario Switch or an Aeropress. Now, for a long time, for anybody starting out and asking me what brewer they should get, I would have just said the Aeropress, full stop. Don't think about anything else. Just go out and get yourself an Aeropress. Now, as time has gone on, I've actually swung more and more over to the Hario Switch, which is basically a Hario V60 that has this base where you can press this switch and hold the coffee in there, and then you flick it up and it all drains out. That's called steep and release, or some people would call that immersion brewing. And that is basically the same principle that the Aeropress uses. It's a really great approach to use when you are just getting started with this stuff, because it's a lot less sensitive to inconsistencies in the grind. You don't need a special kettle. You can just use the regular tea kettle, fill the thing up, and it's not going to have any impact on your brew. The nice thing about the Switch is when you're ready to graduate and start doing more traditional pour over with a gooseneck kettle, more controlled recipes, and you're ready to go into that territory, you can do it without getting anything extra. You just leave the switch valve open all the time, and you can just use it like a regular V60. The Aeropress will do a fantastic immersion brew, but then at a certain point, you're going to want to jump into something else. And the Aeropress can also be a little bit confusing to wrap your head around when you first get them. Once you do it a few times, it's really not an issue, but I will say, put a coffee in a cone-shaped thing and put water in and then let it drain out is a little bit more intuitive than what you need to do with the Aeropress. I will say that if portability is one of your main considerations, then it is really hard to beat an Aeropress. A grinder like this, you can even just stick it right inside, throw the whole thing in your backpack. You're not going to want to do that with this. Now, if you are starting out with a Hario Switch, I would recommend the Cafec filters. I find they make a big difference. You can try them. They're not terribly expensive. I use the Abacus, so I would recommend at least giving that a shot. And if you happen to not love the plastic part of the switch here, there is a little product called the Good Switch that is basically a metal version of this. Pretty cool. And if I was just starting out and all I wanted to do was filter coffee, I would probably stop right there, almost. Today's video is supported by Third Wave Water. They sponsor the channel here. When we first started really getting into coffee, we're rural, so we were on well water, and we would use that water to brew coffee, and we wouldn't really think too much about it. When we would crank on the shower, it would have that sulfury smell that would come out when the water was really hot. But you use your tap water to make coffee. So that's what we did. Then I got some of this stuff and I opened a packet and I put it in a gallon of distilled water and I made coffee with it. And I couldn't believe the difference in taste that it made when I was making my coffee. And that was before we even had stuff totally figured out with coffee making. So I would say if you're just getting started in coffee, you're using your tap water, whether you're rural or municipal, if you got that hard water building up on your taps, or it tastes a little chlorine or a little sulfury, or even if you think it tastes okay, I would recommend giving this stuff a shot. And the team at Third Wave Water is giving you 10% off a one-time order when you use my code. You can get all the info on that in the link below. So we have good coffee, we have our water, and we have a good filter set up. What do you do if you're just getting started and you really want to get into the world of espresso? There are a couple paths that you can take here, and they depend on maybe, let's say, lifestyle or how much of a hobby you want this thing to become, and how high of a ceiling you're looking for when it comes to the taste of your drinks. Now, if you're out there and you just say, Justin, I just want the easiest, simplest, I don't want to worry about it, espresso machine, just tell me which one to get. I want a one and done solution that I can wake up and push a button and get started. For the longest time, the Breville Barista Express was a mainstay, and honestly, that still is a pretty good option if you want to just dump your beans in the top and have everything taken care of in one unit. Ninja has recently come out with an espresso machine as well that offers a lot of the features at a lower price point. Now, if you look, people can have mixed experiences with those Ninjas, but they are coming in less expensive than the Breville as well. Now, if you want to make a little bit more of a hobby of this then there are a couple directions that you can go. And again, I would encourage you to consider the grinder a little bit more heavily than the espresso machine. If you're open to hand grinding, again, the King Grinder K6 is really offering you something pretty good at a ridiculously low price point at the expense of some build quality. If you want to go into an electric grinder, again, I would encourage you to look at those same options. The Baratza Encore ESP, and then if you want to move more into kind of semi-enthusiast territory, I would look at the DF54. Or if you want to get into 64 millimeter size and take a little bit more of a gamble on build quality, the Chardor. Now, when I started, I used a Cuisinart electric espresso machine, and it broke very quickly, in part due to the water that I was using, very hard. I also used it with a blade grinder, which didn't work. And when it broke, I actually got a manual espresso machine, which also didn't work very well until I got a proper grinder for it. All in all, I would probably actually do that again. The quality of espresso that you can get out of a manual espresso maker is mind-bogglingly high for the price that they are. However, they are best only if you don't want to do a lot of milk drinks, I would say. Because if you want to do milk drinks, you got to get a whole separate thing to steam the milk. It just makes the whole process a lot less convenient. I'd also say only consider that direction if you really care about cup quality and you're okay to have a little bit of a slower routine or ritual. They are less convenient to use than an electric machine. Now, that being said, I'm a big fan. I've covered a lot of manual espresso makers on this channel. If you want to drop in right at the lowest end, you can look at the Flare Neo Flex. It's almost even worth just getting just if you want to try it. Now, if you want to make a little bit more of a hobby of things, you're looking for a little bit more automation than a manual espresso maker, but you're hoping to get a little bit more bang for your buck than you get in one of those all-in-one big box machines. I would suggest choosing a grinder from the lists that I've already shared, and then going with a Breville Bambino Plus. It's going to give you that convenient electric workflow. You can still steam milk. You'll have the grinder separate so that if you want to upgrade that later on, you can start customizing your experience as your tastes evolve. And if I was starting out today, those are probably the things that I would do depending on which direction I want it to go in terms of my coffee brewing. But I also recognize that this is a very highly personal decision and you may feel differently than I do. So I want to hear from you. If you were just starting your coffee journey today, how would you start it? What equipment would you choose? Or maybe what is the one tip that you would give to somebody else who is starting today? Let me know in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.